My name is Blair, and I am 33 years old. I walked into the most important interview of my life wearing a maternity suit 2 sizes too big, held together by rusty safety pins. My mother refused to let me buy new clothes, claiming a freeloader did not deserve them. But when a safety pin snapped and I started bleeding in the middle of the executive boardroom, the CEO did not kick me out. She handed me her own $3,000 blazer and whispered a sentence that would ultimately dismantle my entire family's fraudulent empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to tear you down. I stood in the guest bathroom of my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate, aggressively jamming a rusty safety pin into the waistband of a charcoal skirt. The fabric bunched awkwardly around my hips. It was an old maternity suit belonging to my younger sister Courtney. Beverly. My mother leaned against the doorframe holding a crystal glass of morning mimosa. She sneered and tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the marble vanity. "Wear Courtney's old suit," Beverly commanded, her tone dripping with disdain. "A freeloader who just got evicted from her apartment does not get new clothes for an interview. Take an Uber. Malcolm needs the Bentley to drive Courtney to her spa appointment." I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white. I am not a freeloader, Mom. I am a senior financial data risk analyst who got laid off because of a corporate merger. And I would not need to be here if Dad had not frozen my accounts. Beverly rolled her eyes, taking a slow sip of her drink. "You are 33 and living under our roof again. Do not use that tone with me." Before I could respond, Malcolm walked down the hallway. My brother-in-law was a tall, striking African-American man who always wore bespoke Italian suits. He was currently adjusting a perfectly knotted silk tie, a smug smile plastered across his face. Malcolm was the executive vice president at my father's private equity firm, and he never missed an opportunity to remind me of his status. He stopped and looked me up and down, bursting into a harsh laugh. "You are seriously wearing that pile of rags to Vanguard Capital," he mocked. I kept my eyes forward, ignoring the way the oversized blazer swallowed my shoulders. "It is the best I have right now, Malcolm." Malcolm scoffed. "Please do not embarrass the family name today, Blair. My firm is closing a massive deal with Vanguard tomorrow. They are handing us a $25 million bailout. I do not need the executives there thinking my sister-in-law looks like she crawled out of a dumpster." I turned around, the rusty safety pin digging sharply into my side. I would have bought my own clothes if someone had not locked my emergency fund. I marched out of the bathroom and headed straight for the grand staircase where my father Edward was descending. He was wearing his usual tailored golf attire, oblivious to the tension radiating off me. "Dad, I need you to release the $5,000 from the emergency trust you control," I demanded, my voice echoing in the grand foyer. "I need clothes that actually fit. I need to pay a security deposit for a new place. That is my money." Edward paused at the bottom of the stairs, his expression turning cold. He looked at Malcolm and then back at me. "That fund is empty, Blair," he said bluntly. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What do you mean it is empty? That was a high-yield savings account I funded myself when I was a teenager. You just held the custodial rights." "I withdrew it last month," Edward stated, showing absolutely zero remorse. "I needed to cover the remaining costs for Courtney and Malcolm's luxury anniversary gala at the country club. The caviar station alone was 10 grand. You have no say in this house anymore. Your sister is actually contributing to our social standing as a top lifestyle influencer. You are just a burden taking up space." I stared at the 3 people standing in the foyer. My mother clutching her mimosa, my father looking completely detached, and Malcolm smirking as he checked his gold Rolex. They had drained my life savings to throw a party for the golden child, and now they were forcing me to beg for an Uber fare just to get to a job interview. I grabbed the crumpled $20 bill off the counter. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just turned and walked out the heavy oak front doors, leaving them behind. An hour later, I stood in the massive glass-walled lobby of Vanguard Capital in Manhattan. The air conditioning was freezing, and I could feel the oversized skirt slipping dangerously low on my hips. The receptionist directed me to the executive suite on the 50th floor. As I stepped off the elevator, the sheer wealth of the firm was intimidating. This was not just any private equity firm. Vanguard was a titan in the industry, and landing a senior analyst role here was my only ticket out of my parents' house. I was escorted into an immaculate boardroom overlooking the city skyline. I sat down at the long mahogany table, placing my portfolio carefully in front of me. As I shifted in the leather chair, a sharp, agonizing pain shot through my side. The rusty safety pin holding the waistband of Courtney's maternity skirt had completely snapped under the tension. The thick metal wire sliced deeply into my skin, and I gasped sharply. I looked down in horror as a bright red drop of blood began to seep through the thin white blouse I was wearing underneath the blazer. I frantically pressed my hand against my waist, trying to hide the growing stain and keep the skirt from falling apart entirely. Just then, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Maxine Reynolds, the legendary CEO of Vanguard Capital, walked in. She was a commanding presence, sharp, intense, and radiating absolute authority. She carried a stack of files but stopped dead in her tracks the moment she saw me. I tried to stand up to greet her, keeping my arm awkwardly pressed against my bleeding side. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." Maxine did not look at my resume. She did not ask me to sit back down. Her piercing gaze locked immediately onto my waist, where the blood was now clearly visible against the cheap fabric of the oversized suit. She looked at the awkward bunching of the clothes, the mismatched blazer, the sheer panic in my eyes. For a terrifying 5 seconds, the room was completely silent. I braced myself for the rejection. I braced myself for the humiliation of being thrown out of the building. Instead, Maxine dropped the files onto the table. Without breaking eye contact, she smoothly slipped off her own immaculate $3,000 Tom Ford blazer. She walked directly over to me and draped the heavy, luxurious fabric over my shaking shoulders, instantly covering the bloodstain and the terrible fitting blouse. "I know exactly who forced you into that suit," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Button up, Blair. We are going to destroy them." My name is Blair, and sitting across from the most ruthless CEO in Manhattan in a blood-stained skirt, I was about to discover the depth of my family's betrayal. Maxine Reynolds did not wait for my shock to subside. She rounded the massive mahogany conference table and took her seat at the head, gesturing for me to sit opposite her. The $3,000 Tom Ford blazer draped over my shoulders felt like a heavy piece of physical armor against the freezing air conditioning of the Vanguard executive suite. "Your father is a fraud, Blair. A desperate, sinking fraud." Maxine spoke with a voice like a razor blade cutting straight through the sterile corporate atmosphere. I stiffened, pressing my hand against the broken safety pin hidden underneath the borrowed jacket. "I am here to interview for the senior data analyst position, Ms. Reynolds. I am not here to discuss Edward's private equity firm. You are here because Edward is begging Vanguard for a $25 million lifeline." Maxine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood. "They are bleeding cash. Their profit margins are entirely fabricated. And I know this because 10 years ago I helped build that company before your father decided my equity looked better in his own bank account." She slid a sleek silver laptop across the table toward me. "He forced me out during a massive telecom merger. He falsified the valuation metrics, convinced the board of directors that I was a financial liability, and stripped me of my shares. I spent the next decade building Vanguard from the ground up while watching him slowly drive his stolen empire into the ground. Now he is on his knees at my door. But I do not run a charity. If you want a job here, you need to prove you are nothing like the man who shares your last name." She tapped the laptop screen sharply. "Open the file on the desktop. It is a raw, unscrubbed dataset from a mid-size commercial real estate portfolio. The firm holding it is claiming a 20% year-over-year growth. I know they are lying, but standard auditing software cannot catch their buried liabilities. You have 10 minutes to find the rot. If you fail, you can walk back out of here and keep begging your mother for cab fare." I pulled the laptop toward me. I did not flinch. The condescension in her voice was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological warfare I dealt with at the breakfast table every single morning. I opened the file. It was a massive digital labyrinth of nested spreadsheets, shell corporations, and obfuscated debt obligations. Standard regression models would take days to untangle this mess. They would cross-reference the wrong variables and miss the deliberate misclassifications hidden in the offshore holding accounts. I recognized the structure immediately because it was the exact same toxic strategy my father used to hide his own firm's losses. But I was not going to use standard software. I opened a secure browser window and logged into my private encrypted cloud server. For the last 3 years, while my mother paraded my sister Courtney around high society events and forced me to balance the household checkbooks like a glorified unpaid servant I had been coding. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, hiding in my cramped childhood bedroom, I had built a proprietary predictive risk artificial intelligence. I had essentially designed a machine built to catch fraudulent men exactly like my father. I downloaded the massive dataset and dragged it into my algorithm's interface. The screen shifted to a sleek dark mode console. "What is that?" Maxine asked, her eyes narrowing as she watched my fingers fly across the keyboard. "Standard auditors look for what is there," I explained, not taking my eyes off the screen. "My algorithm looks for what is missing. It cross-references micro-fluctuations in dark pool investments against local property tax deficits and predicts default rates with surgical accuracy." I wrote every line of this code myself. I hit enter. The software did not take days to process the data. It did not take 10 minutes. It took exactly 42 seconds. The screen flashed a brilliant crimson highlighting 6 specific shell companies in a cascading list of red text. "There is your rod," I said, sliding the laptop back across the table. "They are shifting their toxic debt into these 6 subsidiaries right before their quarterly reports are generated. Then they dissolve the LLCs and write them off as operational losses. Their actual growth is negative 12%. They are entirely bankrupt." I leaned back in my chair, expecting a nod of approval. I expected her to offer me the job on the spot. Instead, the temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet. Maxine did not smile. She did not look at me. She was frozen, perfectly still, her eyes locked onto the dark mode interface of my algorithm. She stared at the specific geometric logo I had designed for the loading screen and the unique string of command prompts running along the bottom terminal. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating. "Where did you get this code?" Maxine asked. Her voice was no longer sharp. It was a hollow, dangerous whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I frowned, pulling the designer blazer tighter around my shoulders. "I just told you. I wrote it. I have been building the architecture for 3 years in secret. It is entirely my intellectual property." Maxine slowly raised her head. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mix of realization and absolute fury. "Are you absolutely certain no one else has access to this software, Blair?" "Positive," I said, my heart beginning to race against my ribs. "It is secured on a private server." "Why?" Maxine turned the laptop around to face me, tapping a manicured fingernail against my glowing algorithm. "Because yesterday afternoon, your arrogant brother-in-law sat in that exact chair. Malcolm plugged his laptop into our projector and submitted this exact algorithm to my board of directors. He presented it as his own personal creation to secure the $25 million bailout." I stared at Maxine, my mind racing backward to last Tuesday. The eviction notice pasted to my apartment door, my father refusing to co-sign a new lease, and Malcolm showing up with his designer sunglasses offering his customized SUV to transport my boxes. He insisted on carrying my tech equipment to keep it safe. He had my backup hard drive for exactly 45 minutes before dropping my things at my parents' house. That was all the time he needed to clone my entire life's work. He stole my physical backup drive during my eviction, I said, the betrayal burning hot in my chest. He pretended to help me move just so he could strip mine my proprietary data. Maxine did not offer pity. She offered a weapon. She opened the top drawer of the mahogany table, pulled out a thick leather checkbook, and scrawled her signature across a piece of heavy paper. She ripped it out and slid it across the glass toward me. $250,000, Maxine said, her voice sharp and commanding. Consider it a consulting advance from Vanguard Capital. We deposit this into a new secure account immediately. Your father cannot touch it. In exchange, you are going to help me execute a public execution. I looked at the six-figure sum resting on the polished wood. Just an hour ago, I had been humiliated over a crumpled $20 bill. This single piece of paper was enough to rebuild my entire life. But right now, I did not just want financial security. I wanted absolute ruin for the people who had treated me like disposable trash. What is the play? I asked, sliding the check into my portfolio. Malcolm has a live demonstration scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, in front of my entire executive board, Maxine said, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. He thinks he is walking away with $25 million. I want you to go back to that house, play the defeated daughter, and make sure his presentation goes exactly as planned. We need him completely confident before we rip the floor out from under him. An hour later, I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Connecticut estate. The clinking of crystal and loud, arrogant laughter echoed from the formal living room. I walked in to find my family gathered around the marble fireplace. Edward was pouring $2,000 vintage champagne into Courtney's glass. Malcolm stood in the center of the room, holding court, basking in the adoration of a family he was actively scamming. Beverly spotted me first. She looked me up and down, noting the expensive Tom Ford blazer I had stubbornly refused to return to Maxine, assuming it was a cheap knockoff I had bought to save face. "Look who decided to show her face," Beverly sneered, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "Did they laugh you out of the lobby, Blair? Or did you manage to trip and embarrass us in front of the hiring manager?" "The interview was illuminating," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. Malcolm chuckled, adjusting his gold cuffs. "You should have seen the Vanguard executives today, Blair. They were practically eating out of my hand. I pitched a predictive modeling software that is going to revolutionize their risk assessment. It requires a level of genius you simply cannot comprehend. I practically had them begging to write the $25 million check." Courtney leaned against Malcolm, kissing his cheek for the benefit of the selfie video she was currently recording on her phone. "My husband is saving Daddy's company. What did you do today, Blair? Failed to secure a receptionist job?" Edward laughed, clapping Malcolm on the shoulder. "Vanguard is lucky to have a mind like Malcolm's integrating with their systems. It takes a real visionary to navigate modern data architecture." Beverly smiled warmly at Malcolm, then turned her cold gaze back to me. "Actually, once Malcolm closes the deal tomorrow, his new division will need a secretary. If you apologize for your attitude this morning, I might convince him to let you answer his phones. Minimum wage, of course. We cannot reward failure, and you need to learn the value of $1. I looked at my mother, then at my father, who was nodding in agreement. They were drinking champagne to celebrate a thief. They were toasting to my stolen future. I forced the corners of my mouth to turn upward into a defeated, compliant smile. "Thank you, Mom," I said softly, lowering my eyes. "I will think about it. I am going to go upstairs and change out of this suit." I walked past them, ascending the grand staircase. But I did not go to my cramped childhood bedroom. I went straight down the East Wing corridor and slipped into Malcolm's home office. The room reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. His sleek silver laptop was sitting on the mahogany desk. Malcolm was so confident, so entirely convinced of his own invincibility, that he had not even bothered to secure his workstation. The screen was awake, displaying the presentation deck for Vanguard Capital. I stepped up to the desk and minimized his flashy, meaningless PowerPoint slides. I opened the back-end developer console. There it was. My code, my late nights, my missed weekends, my sheer desperation, all neatly packaged under a file named Malcolm Alpha Build. He had not changed a single line of the core architecture. He did not know how. He just slapped his name on my genius. My finger hovered over the delete key. I could wipe the entire drive right now. I could erase the algorithm, format the hard drive, and leave him with absolutely nothing to present tomorrow. It would be an instant disaster for him. but deleting it would just make him look unprepared. Edward would spin a lie, claim technical difficulties, and beg Vanguard for a 1-week extension. That was not good enough. Maxine wanted a public execution, and I was going to give her a massacre. I opened the master configuration file. I did not delete anything. Instead, I navigated to the deep root directory, a place Malcolm did not even know existed, and typed in a new command sequence. I was writing a dormant kill switch directly into the executable file. I set a timer trigger specifically tied to the exact moment the software attempted to process Vanguard's live financial data. I hit save and compiled the updated code. The trap was armed and entirely invisible to the naked eye. Tomorrow morning, when Malcolm stood in front of the Vanguard board of directors and hit run, he was not going to get a simple technical error. He was going to detonate a digital bomb right in his own face. I closed the developer console, left the PowerPoint exactly as I found it, and slipped back out into the hallway, the sound of my family's premature celebration still echoing from downstairs. The next morning, the Vanguard Capital Executive Boardroom was chilled to a precise 68 degrees. I stood in the darkened observation room, pressing my hands against the cool glass of the two-way mirror. Through the hidden window, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive mahogany table. The door swung open and my family strutted inside. They looked less like financial professionals and more like actors cast in a luxury lifestyle commercial. Malcolm wore a custom navy pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car. Courtney was draped in head-to-toe Chanel, her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly blown-out hair as if she owned the building. Edward walked ahead of them, radiating an unearned, arrogant energy. He was acting like a king arriving to collect his tribute rather than a desperate man begging for a $25 million lifeline. Maxine Reynolds sat at the head of the table. She did not stand to greet them. She barely looked up from her tablet. Her silence forced Edward to awkwardly clear his throat and initiate the handshakes. He attempted to act like her equal, ignoring the fact that he had betrayed her a decade ago. Edward introduced Malcolm as his visionary executive vice president, and Courtney as his strategic brand consultant. It was a laughable title for a woman who spent her days posting unboxing videos online. Courtney immediately started complaining about the temperature of the lobby coffee, while Malcolm set up his laptop at the podium. I watched his fingers glide over the trackpad. Those were the exact same fingers that had stolen my hard drive during the lowest moment of my life. He plugged the cord into the wall port, and my proprietary algorithm flashed onto the massive 80-inch display screen behind him. He had actually changed the font to a garish gold color. It took everything in me not to laugh out loud. Maxine leaned back in her leather chair and folded her hands. "The floor is yours, Malcolm," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. "Dazzle me." Malcolm puffed out his chest and launched into a highly rehearsed pitch. He paced the room using aggressive hand gestures and throwing out empty buzzwords like synergy paradigm shifts and dynamic risk mitigation. He claimed he had spent the last 3 years coding this software from scratch. He looked right at Maxine and told her that female executives rarely grasp the complex architecture of predictive modeling, but he was going to make it simple for her. Edward nodded along proudly while Courtney checked her reflection in her phone screen. They were completely oblivious to the trap closing around them. And now, for the live demonstration, Malcolm announced, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. "I will run Vanguard's latest quarterly data through my system and predict your specific market vulnerabilities in seconds." He turned back to his laptop and dramatically hit the enter key. I held my breath in the dark observation room. For 2 seconds, the screen showed a standard loading bar. Then the entire 80-inch display flashed violently red. A massive warning box dominated the screen with bold black text that read, "Fatal error, unauthorized user." A harsh buzzing sound echoed through the boardroom speakers. Malcolm froze. His confident smile completely dissolved. He frantically mashed the escape key, but the red screen remained locked in place. He hit the spacebar. He slapped the side of the laptop. The error message just flashed brighter, illuminating his panicked face in a crimson glow. Edward sat up straight, his face draining of color. "What is happening?" Malcolm Edward demanded. "Fix it right now." Courtney let out an annoyed sigh, complaining that the red light was giving her a severe headache and ruining her lighting for a video. Malcolm began sweating profusely. A dark patch formed under the arms of his expensive custom suit. He stammered out a weak excuse, claiming it was just a temporary firewall glitch caused by Vanguard's local network latency. He started throwing out random tech jargon about compiling errors and server ping rates. It was absolute nonsense. Maxine did not flinch. She watched him sweat for a long, agonizing moment before going in for the kill. "Vanguard does not have local network latency, Malcolm," she stated. "Our servers are hardwired directly to the exchange. Tell me exactly which coding language you use to build the predictive engine." Malcolm swallowed hard, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He mumbled something about standard HTML and Java. It was the equivalent of saying he built a nuclear reactor out of duct tape and cardboard. Maxine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "You built a machine learning financial predictive model using HTML." She asked, her voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. "That is fascinating. Can you explain the neural network parameters you applied to the dataset? Or how about the specific gradient descent algorithm you used to train the model?" Malcolm was visibly shaking now. He looked at Edward for help, but my father was staring at the red screen in absolute terror, realizing his $25 million bailout was vaporizing before his eyes. Malcolm opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely exposed as a fraud in front of the most powerful woman in Manhattan. Maxine picked up her gold pen and tapped it slowly against the mahogany table. The sound echoed through the silent room like a judge striking a gavel. "You do not know the answers, because you do not know the first thing about coding," she said coldly. "You stole this software." Edward jumped to his feet, his face turning a furious shade of purple. "How dare you accuse my son-in-law of theft?" Edward shouted, pointing a finger at Maxine. "We brought you a $25 million opportunity, and you sit there and insult my family. You are just bitter because I outsmarted you 10 years ago, Maxine. You are trying to sabotage our deal." Maxine ignored Edward completely. She kept her eyes locked on Malcolm, who looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Malcolm, if you wrote this algorithm from scratch," Maxine said, pointing her pen directly at the massive red screen, "then perhaps you can explain why line 402 in the hidden source code specifically reads, 'Intellectual property of Blair,' written at 3 a.m. Edward and Courtney snapped their heads toward Malcolm. Malcolm took a stumbling step back from the podium, his mouth hanging open in sheer horror. Before anyone could say another word, I grabbed the handle of the heavy door connecting the observation room to the boardroom. I pushed it open and stepped out of the shadows, walking right into the bright fluorescent light. I was wearing the $3,000 Tom Ford blazer, perfectly tailored and buttoned. I looked directly into my father's horrified eyes and smiled. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room. The silence in the Vanguard executive suite was absolute. Edward and Malcolm were completely paralyzed, staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead. Malcolm's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The smug, arrogant executive who had laughed at my oversized maternity suit 24 hours ago was now visibly trembling. Edward gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His mottled gray face shifted between the massive red error screen projecting his ruin and the sight of his discarded daughter standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman he had betrayed a decade prior. I walked forward, the heavy, luxurious fabric of Maxine Reynolds's Tom Ford blazer moving with me like armor. I did not look away from my father. I let him see every ounce of the confidence he had spent my entire life trying to destroy. Courtney was the first to break the frozen tableau. She slammed her hands down on the table, her designer bracelets clattering loudly against the wood. "Are you out of your mind?" Courtney shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical shrill that echoed terribly in the pristine corporate space. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a psycho, Blair. You broke into our house and hacked my husband's computer." Courtney turned frantically toward Maxine, stepping entirely out of her depth. Ms. Reynolds, you cannot possibly listen to this lunatic. My sister is unstable. She just got evicted. She is broke and jealous of Malcolm's success. She must have planted a virus on his laptop this morning just to sabotage this deal because she is a bitter, pathetic loser. Have security throw her out right now before we call the police. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply walked over to Maxine's desk and picked up the sleek silver presentation remote. You do not need to call the police, Courtney, I said, my voice perfectly steady, because Vanguard's legal team has already contacted the federal authorities. I aimed the remote at the projector and clicked the forward button. The blaring red error message vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of an official government document filled the 80-inch display screen. The seal of the United States Copyright Office glowed brightly in the center. Edward finally found his voice, though it was weak and raspy. What is this? What trick are you playing, Blair? It is not a trick, Edward, I replied, gesturing to the screen. It is a certificate of registration. You see, I knew Malcolm was too arrogant and too lazy to ever build his own infrastructure. When he so generously offered to move my boxes during my eviction, I knew exactly what he was after. I knew he cloned my hard drive. But what Malcolm did not realize, because he does not actually understand how to read raw code, is that I did not just write a predictive risk algorithm. I built an entire corporate entity. I clicked the remote again, highlighting a specific section of the document in bright yellow. I registered the core architecture, the source code, and the proprietary predictive models under an independent limited liability company. 12 months ago, I stated, watching Malcolm's face drain of whatever blood it had left. The intellectual property you just tried to sell to Vanguard Capital for $25 million is fully registered to Sentinel Data Analytics, LLC, a company of which I am the sole founder and CEO. You did not just steal a project, Malcolm. You committed corporate espionage and attempted to defraud a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. Maxine stood up. Her presence immediately commanded the entire room. She walked slowly around the table, stopping just inches away from my father. Edward shrank back into his leather chair, unable to meet her piercing gaze. 10 years ago, you told the board I was a liability, Edward, Maxine said, her voice dangerously quiet. You stole my shares and built your pathetic little kingdom on my foundation. I promised myself I would watch you burn it to the ground. But I have to admit, watching your own daughter light the match is far more satisfying than I ever imagined. Maxine turned to address the entire group. Vanguard Capital officially rejects your request for a $25 million bailout. Your firm is bankrupt. Your profit margins are a complete fabrication, and you just attempted to secure federal funding using stolen intellectual property. Our legal department is currently transmitting this entire presentation, including the video and audio logs of this meeting, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You are finished, Edward. You and your son-in-law will be facing federal fraud charges by the end of the week. Courtney let out a choked gasp, sinking back into her chair and burying her face in her hands. Edward stared blankly at the mahogany table, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to life in prison. The fraudulent empire they had built on my back was officially dead. I looked at Malcolm, expecting to see the same defeated terror, but as I watched, the panic in his eyes suddenly vanished. The frantic sweating stopped. He let out a low, dark chuckle that cut through the heavy silence of the boardroom. He reached down and hauled his bespoke Italian leather briefcase onto the table. You always were too smart for your own good, Blair, Malcolm said, his voice shifting from panic to a sickening predatory smugness. He popped the gold latches of the briefcase. You really thought you outplayed me. You thought you could walk in here with your little LLC and play the conquering hero? He pulled out a thick stack of yellowed legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. He tossed the stack onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of me. You think you won? Malcolm asked, a wicked smirk stretching across his face. Read it, Blair. I stared at the paperwork, a cold knot of dread suddenly forming in my stomach. The header at the top of the page was stamped with a date from 15 years ago. Let me save you the trouble, Malcolm continued, leaning over the table. Do you remember when you turned 18? Edward and Beverly told you that you needed to sign a few documents so they could help manage your student loans and set up your initial banking accounts. You trusted them. You signed exactly where they told you to sign, without reading the fine print. Malcolm tapped the document with his index finger. Under the comprehensive power of attorney, your parents made you sign that day they retain absolute custodial control over your financial and corporate entities. Any asset you acquire, any bank account you open, and any limited liability company you create legally belongs to Edward's primary holding company. Malcolm's smirk widened into a triumphant grin as he looked between me and Maxine. Sentinel Data Analytics, LLC does not belong to you, Blair. It belongs to Edward, which means the algorithm belongs to the firm. You did not trap us. You just handed us the copyright free and clear. The air in the Vanguard executive suite turned to ice. Malcolm's words hung in the sterile boardroom, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the yellowed paper resting on the mahogany table. The legal trap they had sprung was flawless in its cruelty. I remembered that specific day with nauseating clarity. I was 18 years old, frantically packing my bags for my freshman year of college. Edward had slid a dense stack of papers across the kitchen island, impatiently claiming it was a standard custodial procedure so he could manage my student loans and set up my campus checking account. I had trusted my father. I had signed exactly where he pointed, without reading a single word of the fine print. Now, Edward snatched the document from the table, his chest puffing out with renewed, arrogant energy. He pulled his platinum smartphone from his jacket pocket and immediately dialed his wealth management team. Right there, standing in front of Maxine Reynolds, he invoked the sweeping powers of the document. He spoke in rapid, clipped commands. Within 60 seconds, he officially froze my personal checking account, locked my emergency savings, and initiated a hostile corporate takeover of Sentinel Data Analytics, LLC. I felt the blood drain from my face. In the span of a single minute, I had gone from outsmarting my abusers to handing them the keys to my entire future. Courtney, sensing the sudden shift in power, whipped out her phone. She did not even bother leaving the boardroom. She flipped her hair over her shoulder, stepped into the best fluorescent lighting, and started recording a video for her followers. "Hey guys," Courtney purred, batting her eyelashes at the camera lens, while intentionally angling her phone to capture my stunned face in the background. "Just a quick life update. My jealous, unstable sister just tried to steal my husband's proprietary software and claim it as her own. But guess what? We caught her red-handed. Justice always wins. Beware of toxic family members who want to tear down your success." She hit post with a manicured tap, sealing her own digital doom without possessing the brainpower to realize it. Malcolm slammed his laptop shut, looking at Maxine with a victorious, sickening sneer. He adjusted his silk tie, fully expecting her to concede defeat. But Maxine Reynolds did not look defeated. She looked intrigued. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her face. She reached across her desk, pressed a button on her intercom, and summoned Vanguard's corporate legal team. Within 3 minutes, the heavy glass doors swung open. 3 of the most intimidating, high-powered attorneys in Manhattan walked into the executive suite. They did not ask for permission. They did not introduce themselves. The lead attorney, a razor-sharp woman named Evelyn, simply plucked the power of attorney document directly from Edward's hand. Edward protested loudly, demanding she return his private property, but Evelyn completely ignored him. She smoothed the yellowed paper flat on the conference table. Maxine instructed her team to tear into my financial background. She authorized a ruthless deep-dive forensic audit of absolutely everything attached to my social security number since the exact date that document was signed. I retreated to the corner of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Evelyn and her team opened their encrypted legal terminals and ran my credentials through Vanguard's massive intelligence database. The silence in the room stretched for 20 agonizing minutes. The only sound was the rapid, aggressive clicking of keyboards. Edward and Malcolm shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado beginning to crack under the intense, unblinking scrutiny of Vanguard's legal wolves. Suddenly, Evelyn stopped typing. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Without asking, she hijacked the boardroom projector, completely replacing the red error screen of my algorithm with a terrifying complex web of financial records. Edward Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. You did not just use this power of attorney to claim ownership of Sentinel Data Analytics. You have been busy. She highlighted a series of staggering offshore transactions and corporate loan approvals. My stomach lurched as the numbers flashed across the massive display. Over the last 5 years, Edward had systematically used my social security number to secretly take out over $8 million in high-yield commercial business loans. He had tethered the toxic, rotting debt of his failing private equity firm directly to my identity. I was not just broke. According to these federal records, I was personally liable for millions in defaulted corporate loans. He had financially enslaved me to fund Courtney's lifestyle and Malcolm's vanity projects. Edward took a stumbling step backward, his face turning an ashen gray. He tried to stammer out a defense, claiming it was standard corporate restructuring and temporary liability shifting. But Evelyn was not finished. She leaned over the mahogany table and placed her index finger directly on the bottom right corner of the physical power of attorney document. She tapped the faded embossed notary stamp resting right next to my 18-year-old signature. You made a fatal error, Evelyn smirked, turning her piercing gaze directly onto Malcolm. You acted as the notary public for this document. You stamped it yourself to keep the transaction quiet and off the official grid. But Vanguard does its homework. Your state notary license expired 3 months before this signature was ever recorded. Malcolm gasped, physically recoiling as if he had been struck. This document is entirely void, Evelyn stated, her voice echoing with absolute finality. It has never been legally binding, which means every signature you forged, every loan you secured in Blair's name, and every asset you tried to seize today is completely illegal. You did not just steal an algorithm, gentlemen. You committed federal wire fraud. Within 48 hours, Vanguard's legal team moved with the lethal precision of a military strike. Evelyn did not just file a massive civil lawsuit against my father and Malcolm. She handed the entire dossier of forged documents, fraudulent loan applications, and digital footprints directly over to federal prosecutors. A federal judge acted swiftly, instantly freezing every single asset tied to Edward's holding company. His corporate bank accounts, his offshore shell entities, and his personal funds were completely locked down. Even the lines of credit he used to maintain his country club memberships were severed. The fraudulent empire was suffocated overnight. To ensure my safety and protect their new $25 million investment, Maxine Reynolds relocated me to a secure luxury penthouse in Tribeca. The Vanguard Executive Protection Program fully funded the sweeping glass-walled apartment while the legal dust settled. For the first time in my life, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Manhattan skyline and breathing free air. The peace was shattered on a Thursday afternoon. The heavy oak door of my penthouse suddenly flew open, crashing violently against the expensive drywall. Vanguard security downstairs was usually impenetrable, but Courtney had always possessed a terrifying talent for manipulating her way into places she did not belong. She stormed into my living room looking like a deranged hurricane. The stark contrast between her usual manicured influencer perfection and her current unhinged state was jarring. Her designer mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines, and she was clutching a fistful of useless platinum credit cards. Courtney began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with genuine hysteria. She swept her arm across my entryway console table, sending a row of heavy decorative bowls crashing to the hardwood floor. She shrieked that her card was declined at Bergdorf Goodman in front of her entire social circle. She had tried to buy a $10,000 handbag to soothe her nerves, and the machine had loudly rejected every single piece of plastic in her wallet. She accused me of destroying her life, her marriage, and her personal brand. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the coffee table and hurled it across the room. It struck a large antique mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 jagged pieces that rained down over the expensive rug. Right behind her, panting heavily and clutching her chest, was my mother, Beverly. She looked entirely disheveled, the pristine suburban matriarch facade completely stripped away. She rushed toward me, completely ignoring the rampant destruction Courtney was actively causing in my home. Beverly grabbed my arm, her nails digging painfully through the fabric of my sweater. Her eyes were frantic red and swimming with manipulative tears. "Drop the lawsuit!" Beverly sobbed, her voice trembling with practiced victimhood. "I sold my grandmother's diamonds to keep this family afloat. You owe us some loyalty. You cannot do this to your own blood." I yanked my arm out of her grip, the sheer audacity of her lie setting my blood on fire. The diamonds! She actually had the nerve to bring up the diamonds. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and refused to give her an inch of ground. "You sold those diamonds to pay off Courtney's gambling debts in college, then told Dad I stole them." I fired back, my voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings of the penthouse. "You fenced your own family heritage to save your golden child from a bookie who was threatening to break her legs. And then you let Dad throw me out of the house for a crime you committed to protect her. Get out!" Beverly gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, the ugly truth finally hanging exposed in the open air. Courtney froze, the brass bookend dropping heavily from her hands. For a fleeting second, I thought the revelation had finally broken through her delusion. But instead of showing remorse, a terrifying, calculated darkness washed over my sister's face. The hysterical crying abruptly stopped. She looked at the shattered mirror on the floor, then down at a large, jagged shard of a broken glass vase resting near her designer boots. Without a single second of hesitation, Courtney dropped to her knees. She grabbed the sharpest piece of broken glass, gripped it tightly in her fist, and intentionally dragged it hard across her own forearm. Blood instantly welled up from the deep slice, spilling bright crimson down her pale skin and dripping onto the pristine hardwood floor. Before my mother or I could even process the horrific reality of her self-mutilation, Courtney pulled a hidden backup phone from her waistband. She wiped the tears back into her eyes, hitting the live button on her Instagram account. She hoisted the phone high into the air, pointing her violently bleeding arm directly at the camera lens. "Help!" Courtney screamed, her voice cracking with perfect, terrifying influencer hysterics as tens of thousands of her followers instantly tuned in. "My sister is trying to kill me for my husband's money." The internet moves with terrifying speed. Within 1 hour of Courtney hitting that live button, my face was plastered across every gossip blog, social media platform, and local news channel. The comment sections were an absolute bloodbath. I was branded a deranged, jealous sister who violently attacked a defenseless woman over money. Courtney played her victim role to absolute perfection. She posted tearful updates from a hospital bed, wrapping her bandaged arm in cashmere and thanking her followers for their prayers. The digital lynch mob was relentless, calling for my immediate arrest. Edward and Beverly wasted no time weaponizing the public sympathy. With their corporate assets frozen by the federal judge and the SEC breathing down their necks, they were suffocating. They needed untraceable private cash to hire criminal defense attorneys before the federal wire fraud indictments went public. Their solution was predictably garish. They hosted their annual high society charity gala at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a spectacular display of financial delusion. They were literally bankrupt, but they somehow managed to rent out the grand ballroom, filling it with imported white orchids and a live string quartet. They were using the gala as a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to secure emergency funding from wealthy, out-of-touch investors who had not yet read the financial warning signs. I stood in the shadows of the country club foyer, smoothing the lapels of my tailored black suit. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy socialites inside. Maxine Reynolds had instructed her elite crisis management team to keep me entirely off the grid for the last 48 hours. I did not release a statement. I did not defend myself online. I simply waited for the perfect moment to strike. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and walked directly into the center of the grand ballroom. The effect was instantaneous. The string quartet missed a note and slowly faded into an awkward silence. The low hum of conversation evaporated, replaced by a sharp collective gasp from the 300 guests. I scanned the room. My mother was standing near the ice sculpture holding a martini glass. She physically recoiled when she saw me, her face draining of color. Edward was mid-sentence with a prominent real estate developer. His jaw locked instantly. And then there was Courtney. She was standing near the center stage wearing a sleeveless emerald gown specifically chosen to display the thick, stark white medical bandage wrapped around her forearm. She was surrounded by a circle of sympathetic, wealthy wives, soaking up their pity like a sponge. When she saw me, her eyes went wide with genuine panic. Malcolm was the first to react. He stepped in front of Courtney, playing the role of the fiercely protective husband. He signaled aggressively to the country club security guards stationed near the exits. "How did she get past the gate?" Malcolm shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my chest, making sure every wealthy investor in the room could hear him. "Grab her right now. This woman is a violent liability. She is mentally unstable, and she just tried to murder my wife. I want her arrested and removed from this property immediately." Two burly security guards in dark suits began marching toward me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, giving them a clear path. Whispers of disgust rippled through the audience. People were actively pulling out their phones, ready to record my humiliating arrest. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground in the center of the ballroom, looking right through Malcolm. "You are throwing a charity gala on bounced credit cards." "Malcolm," I stated, my voice cutting through the tension with lethal calm. "You are standing in front of 300 people begging for money because a federal judge froze your bank accounts for wire fraud yesterday morning." Edward abandoned his conversation and rushed forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Shut your mouth, Blair," Edward snarled, gesturing frantically at the advancing guards. "Get this lunatic out of here. She is lying. She is trying to ruin our charity event." I checked my watch, ignoring the heavy footsteps of the guards approaching me from behind. "I am not trying to ruin your event, Edward," I replied, my gaze shifting up to the massive VIP balcony overlooking the ballroom. "I am just providing the evening entertainment." Right as the first security guard reached out to grab my shoulder, the main breaker for the grand ballroom was flipped. The massive crystal chandeliers instantly went dark, plunging the entire country club into pitch blackness. A chorus of confused shouts and panicked screams erupted from the wealthy guests. I heard Courtney shriek something about her dress being stepped on. The darkness lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom slammed shut. The distinct heavy click of commercial deadbolts echoed through the space. Maxine Reynolds' personal corporate security team had silently secured the perimeter, blockading every single exit. No one was leaving. Suddenly, the massive 40-foot LED screen behind the main stage flickered to life. It cast a harsh, cold blue light across the terrified faces of the crowd. The screen was not displaying the charity donation tracker. It was projecting a crystal-clear, unedited 4K video feed. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, horrified silence. On the massive screen, the guests watched a high-definition security recording of my Vanguard penthouse. The audio pumped through the country club's surround sound speakers with crystal clarity. Every single person in the room watched Courtney storm into my apartment screaming about her declined credit cards. They watched her sweep the decorative bowls off the table. They watched Beverly admit to selling her grandmother's diamonds to pay off Courtney's gambling debts. And then came the grand finale. The entire audience gasped in unison as the 40-foot screen showed Courtney picking up a sharp, jagged shard of a broken glass vase. They watched in absolute stunned silence as she intentionally dragged the glass across her own arm, slicing her skin. They watched her wipe away her fake tears, pull out her phone, and hit the live button. The video looped, freezing on Courtney's distorted, screaming face as she faked the attack. The lights in the ballroom suddenly snapped back on, flooding the room with blinding brightness. Every single face in the crowd slowly turned to look directly at Courtney. The heavy silence holding the grand ballroom hostage shattered into a deafening roar of absolute revulsion. 300 of the city's wealthiest elites stared at Courtney with naked disgust. The woman who just seconds ago had been soaking up their pity was now exposed as a deranged fraud. Courtney stumbled backward, her emerald gown suddenly looking ridiculous against her pale, panicked face. She frantically pointed at the massive LED screen, stammering out a pathetic defense. She claimed it was an AI deepfake, a malicious digital manipulation engineered by my tech company. The crowd did not buy a single second of it. The 4K security footage was immaculate, capturing every fiber of her designer clothes and every drop of her own blood. A prominent socialite in the front row actually laughed out loud, a harsh biting sound that cut right through Courtney's lies. The backlash was instantaneous. The real estate developer who had been chatting with Edward just minutes prior stormed over to the main donation table. He violently ripped a sealed white envelope out of the crystal collection box. Other investors immediately followed suit. The mayor's wife demanded her check back loudly, declaring she would not fund a family of federal criminals. The lavish charity gala was dissolving into a wealthy riot. Investors were aggressively reclaiming their thousands, shouting for their money, and threatening lawsuits before the night was even over. Edward watched his emergency escape fund vaporize before his eyes. The untraceable private cash he desperately needed to hire criminal defense attorneys was walking right out the door. He scanned the angry crowd, then looked up at the VIP balcony where Maxine's security team stood like stone statues. He realized the exits were still barricaded. The federal agents were closing in and his social empire was burning to ash. So my father did the only thing a cornered coward knows how to do. He created a distraction. Edward suddenly grabbed his chest, letting out a loud, ragged gasp. He staggered forward, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes before collapsing heavily onto the polished dance floor. Beverly let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping to her knees beside him. She shrieked for someone to call an ambulance, claiming the stress of my cruel ambush had sent her husband into a massive cardiac arrest. It was a pathetic theatrical performance, but it served its purpose. The angry investors stepped back, giving the supposed dying man some space. Maxine Reynolds nodded sharply from the balcony. Her security team immediately unlocked the heavy oak doors, throwing them wide open to allow medical personnel inside. I stood my ground, watching the paramedics rush into the ballroom with a stretcher. They loaded Edward onto the gurney, wheeling him rapidly out into the crisp night air. Beverly trailed behind them, sobbing loudly for the remaining audience. Courtney and Malcolm practically sprinted out the doors, using the medical emergency as their only cover to escape the hostile crowd. I followed them out, keeping a safe distance in the shadows of the country club's grand portico. The scene outside was pure chaos. Valets were scrambling to pull luxury vehicles around for the mass exodus of disgusted guests. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the cold evening air. The paramedics had paused near the loading zone of the ambulance, preparing to check Edward's vitals. The second they were clear of the country club doors and out of sight from the wealthy investors, Edward miraculously recovered. The agonizing chest pain vanished instantly. He slapped the paramedic's hands away, sitting straight up on the gurney with lethal focus. He waved the medical staff off, growling that he just needed a moment to breathe. The paramedics, clearly annoyed by the blatant manipulation, stepped away to consult with their dispatcher. Edward swung his legs off the stretcher and marched directly toward Malcolm. The frantic, panicked father routine was gone, replaced by the ruthless corporate shark who had spent his life destroying anyone in his path. He grabbed Malcolm violently by the lapels of his custom navy suit, slamming him backward against the side of the ambulance. Malcolm choked in surprise, his hands coming up to pry my father's fingers off his collar. "Listen to me, you pathetic little fraud!" Edward spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The federal wire fraud indictments are coming tomorrow. Vanguard's legal team has our heads on a spike. But there is only one way out of this." Malcolm struggled against the grip, his eyes darting frantically toward Courtney, who was standing a few feet away, completely paralyzed. "You are going to take the fall for the forged notary signature," Edward commanded, tightening his grip on Malcolm's suit. "You stamped that power of attorney with an expired license. You executed the wire fraud. You will tell the federal prosecutors that you acted alone to secure those business loans." Malcolm stared at him in sheer disbelief, his face turning pale under the amber glow of the streetlights. "You cannot be serious," Malcolm choked out. "That is 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I did that for you. I secured those loans to save your failing company." "You did it because I told you to," Edward snarled, shoving Malcolm harder against the metal door. "I pulled you out of a miserable mid-level accounting firm. I bought you your cars, your house, And I gave you my daughter. You owe me for giving you this lifestyle. You are the expendable asset, Malcolm. You will take the blame, or I will make sure my legal team buries you so deep you will never see daylight again." The air between them crackled with lethal tension. Edward expected submission. He expected the coward he had molded to bow his head and take the hit. But Edward severely underestimated the parasitic survival instincts of a man who had spent his entire career stealing from others. Malcolm's panicked expression suddenly vanished. A cold, dead calm washed over his face. He aggressively shoved both of his hands against my father's chest, breaking Edward's grip and pushing him hard, stumbling backward. Malcolm smoothed the wrinkled lapels of his jacket. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out his platinum smartphone, holding it up between them. The screen was illuminated, displaying an active audio recording app. The red timer was ticking upward, capturing every single second of their exchange. "I am not going down for you, old man." Malcolm sneered, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "I just recorded that." The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance illuminated Malcolm's triumphant and terrified face. Edward looked as though he had been struck by lightning. The mighty patriarch of the family was instantly reduced to a gasping, cornered animal by his own hand-picked scapegoat. I did not stick around to watch the paramedics finally load my father onto the stretcher. The trap was completely set and the jaws had snapped shut. Maxine Reynolds and I had won. The next morning, the air in the underground VIP parking garage at Vanguard headquarters was thick with the scent of damp concrete and expensive exhaust. I stepped out of the private elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I was scheduled to meet with the federal prosecutors at 9 to formally hand over the final pieces of digital evidence. Blair, wait. The voice echoed off the concrete walls, shrill and laced with a desperate panic I had never heard before. I stopped, my hand resting on the door handle of the black town car Maxine had assigned to me. Beverly stepped out from behind a thick concrete pillar. The transformation was staggering. The pristine suburban matriarch who had hosted a lavish gala just 12 hours ago was entirely gone. Her designer makeup was smeared. Her hair was flat and she was wearing a heavy coat hastily thrown over yesterday's wrinkled clothes. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. I turned to face her, crossing my arms securely over my chest. I gave her absolutely zero emotional ground. "You have exactly 30 seconds, Beverly, before I call Vanguard security and have you arrested for trespassing." She flinched, taking a hesitant, cautious step forward. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched a small, faded velvet box against her chest. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the empty garage as if expecting federal agents to drop from the ceiling at any moment. "Please, Blair," she begged, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "You have to stop this. You proved your point. Edward is in the hospital on suicide watch, and Courtney has not stopped crying since last night. You destroyed us. Are you happy now?" I felt a cold wave of absolute satisfaction wash over my chest. "I am not happy, Beverly. I am just balancing the scales." 29 seconds. She rushed forward, closing the physical distance between us. She thrust the velvet box into my hands with frantic, manic energy. "I want to make a deal," she whispered, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "A real deal. We can end this right now as a family." I looked down at the faded velvet box, then back up at her desperate face. "What kind of deal?" "You dropped the civil lawsuit against your father," she said, her words spilling out in a desperate rush. "You tell the prosecutors that Malcolm acted entirely alone. Malcolm has the recording of Edward, but if you testify that Malcolm masterminded the entire wire fraud scheme, they will focus entirely on him. We let Malcolm take the fall. He goes to federal prison and Edward gets to quietly retire." The sheer depravity of her proposal hung heavily in the damp garage air. She was entirely willing to sacrifice her golden child's husband, throwing the father of her grandson into a federal penitentiary just to save her own luxurious lifestyle. There was no loyalty in this family. There was only a ruthless demand for survival. "And what exactly makes you think I would ever agree to perjure myself for you?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Beverly pointed a trembling finger at the velvet box in my hands. "Because of what is inside that box. She stood up a little taller, trying to summon her old authoritative presence. That is the Harrison family diamond. It has been in my family for 4 generations. It is a flawless 6-carat estate piece worth easily $500,000. I am giving it to you, Blair. It is your inheritance. Take the ring, sell it, start your new life, and let your father go. I slowly opened the velvet box. Sitting on the faded satin cushion was a massive glittering stone set in heavy platinum. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking garage, it caught the light, casting tiny prismatic rainbows across the concrete walls. It looked heavy. It looked expensive. It looked exactly like the ring Beverly used to wear to country club dinners when I was a child. I stared at the stone for a long time. Beverly let out a long, shaky breath, clearly believing she had won. She thought my silence was the sound of a woman being bought. I reached into the box and pulled the heavy ring out, holding it up to the fluorescent light. Then I tilted my head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, cutting laugh that echoed loudly through the entire underground garage. Beverly took a shocked step backward, her momentary relief vanishing instantly. "What is so funny?" she demanded, her voice pitching upward in panic. "That is a priceless heirloom." I stopped laughing and looked my mother dead in the eyes. My gaze was absolute ice. "This is a cubic zirconia fake, Beverly," I stated plainly, tossing the ring back into the velvet box with a sharp thud. "I know exactly what this is because I know exactly what you did a decade ago." Beverly froze. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and sickly. "You pawned the real Harrison diamond 10 years ago." I continued, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look at me. "You fenced the real family heirloom to cover up the money Edward embezzled from his first business partner. You sold your own grandmother's legacy to keep your husband out of jail, and you had a cheap replica made to fool your high society friends. You are trying to bribe me with a piece of worthless glass." She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her jaw trembled, and she took another stumbling step backward, clutching her coat tightly around her chest. The mask was completely shattered. There were no more lies she could tell. She was bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. "You have nothing left to trade." "Beverly," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "you sold out your daughter. You tried to sell out your son-in-law, and you tried to buy your way out of federal prison with a fake ring. You are completely out of moves. Please." She gasped, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Genuine tears of absolute terror. I did not know what else to do. Edward handles the money. I just signed the papers he told me to sign. I did not know it was fraud. I smiled a predatory, calculated smile. That is the exact defense Malcolm is going to use against Edward. Before Beverly could respond, the heavy metal door leading to the stairwell swung open with a loud, echoing bang. A tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a plain gray suit, stepped out into the parking garage. He walked with absolute purpose, his eyes locked directly on my mother. Beverly whipped her head around, her eyes wide with terror. She instinctively took a step toward me, as if seeking protection, but I did not move an inch. "Beverly Harrison," the man asked, his voice booming across the concrete. She did not answer. She just stood there, paralyzed like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. The man closed the distance and thrust a thick, heavy stack of legal documents directly against her chest. She had no choice but to grab them, to prevent them from hitting the floor. "You have been officially served," he stated sharply, turning on his heel and walking back toward the stairwell without another word. Beverly stared down at the massive stack of papers in her hands. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for an explanation she already knew. "You're being subpoenaed, Mom," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "Those are from the federal prosecutor's office. You told me you just signed the papers Edward told you to sign. Well, the federal government agrees. Your signature is on the fraudulent loan applications, too. You're a co-conspirator." The velvet box slipped from her hands. It hit the concrete floor, the fake diamond bouncing away into the shadows. Beverly dropped to her knees, the heavy stack of federal subpoenas clutched against her chest as a loud, agonizing sob ripped from her throat. The air inside the executive boardroom on the 50th floor was suffocating. Edward stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, looking like a cornered animal. Panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, a stark contrast to the absolute ruin closing in around him. His normally immaculate bespoke suit was heavily wrinkled and dark sweat stains had formed beneath his arms. The SEC was actively circling his empire. The federal wire fraud indictments were imminent. Malcolm's audio recording had undoubtedly reached the prosecutors by now, and Beverly was currently being served with federal subpoenas in a damp parking garage. Edward had completely run out of time. He slammed his fist against the polished wood, demanding the attention of the 6 remaining board members. They sat rigidly in their high-backed leather chairs, staring at him with a mixture of fear and growing disgust. "We are executing a total emergency liquidation," Edward barked, his voice cracking with manic desperation. "I want every single unrestricted asset sold off by the end of the hour. We are moving the entire $40 million capital reserve to the offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. We will frame it to the press as a strategic restructuring to weather the current market volatility. I have a private jet waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro. We move the cash and we leave today." The chief financial officer, a pale, balding man named Arthur, who had loyally covered up Edward's questionable accounting for a decade, finally shook his head. Arthur pulled off his glasses, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "We cannot do that, Edward," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "The federal judge already froze the primary accounts. Moving the remaining liquid assets offshore while under active federal investigation is financial suicide. It is blatant evasion. If we sign off on that wire transfer, we are all going to federal prison." Edward leaned over the table, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He bared his teeth, showing his true vicious colors. "You will sign the authorization right now," Edward snarled, spit flying from his lips. "I built this company from absolutely nothing. I put the millions in your pockets. You are all completely complicit in every single manipulated tax return and every forged loan document. You sign the transfer, or I swear to God I will hand your names directly over to the feds and tell them you masterminded the entire operation." He was treating his own board of directors exactly how he had treated me, and exactly how he had treated Malcolm. He viewed everyone around him as disposable human shields, meant only to guarantee his own survival. Before the terrified CFO could even pick up a pen, the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom violently burst open. The solid wood crashed loudly against the expensive drywall, completely shattering the tense, suffocating silence. I stepped right through the threshold. Maxine Reynolds walked in perfect synchronization beside me, looking like a lethal corporate executioner in a razor-sharp charcoal suit. Edward physically jumped backward, his chair crashing loudly to the hardwood floor, his face drained of whatever color was left, turning a sickly shade of ash. He stared at me as if a ghost had just walked into his impenetrable fortress. The remaining board members froze, recognizing Maxine instantly. Vanguard's reputation for ruthless corporate dismantling preceded her in every financial circle in the city. "What is she doing here?" Edward screamed, his voice pitching into absolute hysteria. He frantically slammed his palm against the emergency intercom button wired into the center of the table. "Security, get up here right now. We have a breach in the executive suite. I want these women arrested and physically dragged out of this building immediately." 2 uniformed security guards, who had been stationed in the outer hallway, rushed into the room. They moved aggressively toward me, and Maxine, their hands reaching for their radios. Maxine simply turned her head and locked eyes with the lead guard. She gave a single slow nod. The guards stopped dead in their tracks. They lowered their hands, completely ignoring Edward's frantic screaming. They stepped backward, crossing their arms, and taking up defensive positions flanking the doorway. They were not there to throw me out. They were there to make sure nobody else escaped. Edward stared at the guards, his mind completely failing to process the betrayal. He hammered the intercom button again. "Did you not hear me? I pay your salaries. Grab her right now." I did not wait for him to finish his tantrum. I walked with slow, deliberate steps directly toward the head of the table. The terrified board members actively leaned away from me, pushing their chairs back to give me a clear path. I reached the mahogany table and stopped right in front of my father. I lifted the massive, heavy legal binder I had been carrying and slammed it down onto the polished wood. The thunderous crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom, making every single executive flinch. I looked Edward dead in the eyes, watching his entire legacy completely collapse in real time. "Security works for me now, Edward," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and laced with absolute unyielding authority. "I used my $25 million consulting advance from Vanguard to buy up 51% of your firm's outstanding debt. I am your biggest creditor, and I'm foreclosing on your company." Edward stared at the heavy binder as if it were a live grenade. The reality of his absolute ruin finally cracked through his thick skull. I had not just exposed his fraud, I had legally purchased his demise. He had leveraged absolutely everything to keep his sinking empire afloat, including the deed to the Oak Ridge family estate. "You put the family mansion up as collateral for those fraudulent shell company loans," Edward said, my voice echoing off the panoramic glass walls. "The moment you defaulted yesterday morning, the bank called in the debt. Vanguard authorized me to buy that paper for pennies on the dollar. You do not just lose this company today, you lose the house." Edward opened his mouth, but a pathetic wheezing sound was all that came out. He looked to his CFO for support, but Arthur was already frantically stuffing documents into his leather briefcase, completely abandoning his boss to save himself. The two security guards moved forward, grabbing my father by the arms of his wrinkled bespoke suit. They did not politely ask him to leave. They physically dragged the former billionaire out of his own executive suite, while his board of directors watched the forceful eviction in absolute silence. By early afternoon, the massive wrought iron gates of the Oak Ridge estate were locked wide open. A sleek white moving truck sat idling in the circular driveway, alongside two local sheriff's cruisers. I stood on the pristine front lawn, breathing in the crisp air, and watching my childhood prison being legally seized. The property was officially mine, and the eviction notice was effective immediately. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors into the grand foyer. The scene inside was pure chaotic entitlement. Beverly was completely absent, likely sitting in a windowless room with a criminal defense attorney dealing with the reality of her new federal subpoenas. But Courtney was right there in the center of the marble floor, throwing the tantrum of a lifetime. She was surrounded by a literal mountain of Louis Vuitton trunks and Chanel garment bags. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy knot, and she was screaming at the top of her lungs at the two burly moving men carrying a vintage armchair out of the formal living room. "Put that down, you incompetent fools!" Courtney shrieked, waving her manicured hands frantically. "That chair is imported from Italy. You are going to scratch the wood. I will sue this entire moving company into bankruptcy." She spun around and locked eyes with me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She stomped across the marble floor, her designer heels clicking sharply, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a monster, Blair," she spat, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "You orchestrated this entire thing because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of my life and my marriage. You think you can just march in here and take my home." "I did not take your home, Courtney," I replied, maintaining a perfectly calm and level tone. "Your father gambled it away to pay for your lavish lifestyle. I just bought the winning ticket. You have exactly 45 minutes to get your designer bags off my property before the sheriffs physically remove you for trespassing." Courtney let out a sound of pure disgust. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to accept the brutal reality of her situation. She still fully believed this was a temporary inconvenience, a minor billing error that could simply be swept under the rug. She was the golden child, and golden children did not end up on the street. The heavy front door swung open again. Malcolm stepped into the foyer. He looked completely exhausted, his tie loosened and his designer jacket slung over one shoulder. He took one look at the uniformed sheriffs, the stack of moving boxes, and the mountain of luxury luggage sitting on the marble floor. Courtney instantly lunged toward him, grabbing his arm with desperate manic energy. "Malcolm, Thank God you are here, she cried, pulling him toward her bags. You need to fix this right now. Blair is trying to evict us. Call your finance guys. Write a check to these stupid sheriffs. Call the offshore accounts and transfer the funds to buy this house back. I am not packing my bags and I am not leaving my home. She looked at him with wide, expectant eyes, waiting for her wealthy husband to wave his magic wand and make the bad things go away. She waited for the man who had funded her luxury shopping sprees and her five-star vacations to shield her from the consequences of her own family's actions. Malcolm did not move. He stood completely still, staring at the mountain of expensive leather luggage and then down at his wife. He looked at her not with love or protection, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a corporate accountant reviewing a toxic balance sheet. He had spent the entire morning listening to that audio recording of Edward threatening him. He knew the federal wire fraud indictments were dropping tomorrow morning. He knew the offshore accounts were completely frozen by the SEC. He knew Edward was going down, and he knew Beverly was going down with him. The entire Harrison family was radioactive, and Malcolm refused to catch the fallout. Malcolm slowly pulled his arm out of Courtney's desperate grip. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not pull out a checkbook. He did not pull out a black titanium credit card. He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. Courtney frowned, looking at the brown paper. What is that? Malcolm, just fix this. I am not fixing anything. Malcolm said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He held the envelope out, extending it toward her chest until she was forced to take it. Courtney looked down at the envelope, her hands trembling as she held the thick stack of paper. What are you doing? Here are the divorce papers. Malcolm stated, his words dropping like heavy stones onto the marble floor. You are broke, and I am testifying against your father to save myself. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the federal courthouse conference room cast a sickly gray pallor over my father. 2 weeks had passed since the eviction at the Oak Ridge estate and the absolute dismantling of Vanguard. Edward had managed to secure a mid-level defense attorney, likely using the very last hidden scraps of his drained offshore accounts. Despite losing his company, his mansion, and his pristine social standing, Edward still sat at the long metal table with his chin tilted upward, radiating the arrogant delusion of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. I sat silently in the back corner of the room with Maxine Reynolds watching the deposition unfold. Beverly sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a court-appointed lawyer, looking frail and utterly defeated. Directly across from Edward sat Malcolm. The former scapegoat was sitting incredibly straight, his face an unreadable mask of cold determination. The Assistant United States Attorney, a sharp woman with piercing dark eyes, leaned forward and adjusted her microphone. She methodically walked Edward through the timeline of the Vanguard capital embezzlement, the forged notary stamps, and the massive fraudulent loans secured under Beverly's name. Mr. Harrison, the prosecutor stated, her tone strictly professional. The financial paper trail clearly shows millions of dollars diverted into private Cayman accounts directly benefiting your personal estate. Do you claim to have no knowledge of these wire transfers? Edward adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, offering a patronizing smile. I had absolutely zero knowledge of those transactions, he declared, his voice dripping with rehearsed confidence. I am a visionary. I am a big-picture executive. I trusted my chief financial officer, and I implicitly trusted my son-in-law. Malcolm was desperate to impress me. He wanted the lavish lifestyle. He wanted the cars and the country club memberships. He masterminded this entire wire fraud scheme to artificially inflate his own value within my company. He went rogue. Malcolm did not flinch. He just stared at Edward, his eyes completely dead. The prosecutor flipped a page in her thick binder. And the fraudulent personal loans. The ones secured using your family estate as collateral. The applications bear your wife's signature, and the funds were funneled into an account solely managed by you. Edward let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shifting his gaze toward Beverly. My mother physically shrank into her chair, terrified of what was coming next. My wife handles all of our domestic accounts, Edward said, completely throwing the woman who had stood by him for 30 years straight into the federal fire. Beverly has always had expensive tastes. She signed those loan applications on her own accord to maintain her social standing. I never saw the documents, and I certainly never authorized them. I am the victim of a greedy son-in-law and a financially irresponsible wife. Beverly let out a muffled sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. She had ruined her relationship with me to protect this man, and he was cutting her throat in a federal deposition without a second thought. The prosecutor looked directly at Malcolm's attorney. Does your client have anything to add regarding Mr. Harrison's statements? Malcolm's lawyer, a sharp, ruthless litigator who specialized in white-collar plea deals, stood up. He walked over to the center of the table and placed a small digital audio player next to the recording equipment. Just for the record, Mr. Harrison, the lawyer asked calmly, you are testifying under oath that you had absolutely no prior knowledge of these crimes and that you never instructed my client to commit wire fraud on your behalf. I swear under penalty of perjury, Edward answered smoothly, completely certain he had successfully insulated himself. Malcolm acted entirely alone. Malcolm's lawyer reached down and pressed play on the digital device. The audio was incredibly clear. The background noise of ambulance sirens and shouting paramedics filled the quiet deposition room, followed immediately by the unmistakable booming voice of Edward Harrison. Listen to me, you pathetic little fraud. The federal wire fraud indictments are coming tomorrow. Vanguard's legal team has our heads on a spike. But there is only one way out of this. You are going to take the fall for the forged notary signature. You stamped that power of attorney with an expired license. You executed the wire fraud. You will tell the federal prosecutors that you acted alone to secure those business loans. You cannot be serious. That is 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I did that for you. I secured those loans to save your failing company. You did it because I told you to. I pulled you out of a miserable mid-level accounting firm. You will take the blame, or I will make sure my legal team buries you so deep you will never see daylight again. The audio clicked off. The heavy silence that descended upon the conference room was absolutely suffocating. Edward looked like he had been physically struck by a train. All the arrogant color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow shell of a man. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His defense attorney immediately slammed his hands down on the table, frantically whispering into Edward's ear and waving at the court reporter to stop the transcript. Beverly stared at her husband in absolute horror, finally realizing the true depth of the monster she had protected all these years. Malcolm simply adjusted his tie, leaning back in his chair, with the profound relief of a man who had just handed his executioner the guillotine. The prosecuting attorney slowly closed her thick legal binder. She looked across the table, her eyes locking onto my father with a cold, triumphant smile. Mr. Edward, she said, her voice ringing with absolute finality, you just perjured yourself under oath on federal record. The FBI is waiting outside. The heavy oak doors of the conference room had barely begun to open when Edward's survival instinct finally kicked into high gear. He did not freeze, and he certainly did not surrender. Before the prosecuting attorney could signal the agents waiting in the primary corridor, my father shoved his heavy leather chair backward with brutal force. It crashed into the wall, giving him a split-second head start. He bolted for the secondary door at the back of the room, the one reserved for the judge's private chambers. His mid-level defense attorney shouted in protest, but Edward ignored him, shouldering his way through the heavy wood and sprinting down the restricted maintenance stairwell. He moved with the desperate, frantic energy of a man watching his entire life evaporate. He bypassed the main lobby, entirely bursting out of the courthouse through the underground loading dock and disappearing into the crowded afternoon streets of the city. Upstairs in the conference room, the FBI agents breached the doors only to find an empty chair. The lead agent cursed loudly, pulling out his radio to order a perimeter lockdown. Maxine Reynolds turned to me, raising a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She adjusted the cuffs of her suit, clearly unbothered by the dramatic escape. I smiled, folding my hands neatly on the metal table. "Let him run," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. A cornered rat will always scramble for the nearest drain. The lead FBI agent marched over to the table, demanding to know if we had any idea where he might go. I simply opened my leather briefcase and handed him a printed flight manifest. My sister Courtney was scheduled to leave for a luxury influencer brand trip to Dubai this afternoon. I explained, tapping the paper with my index finger. The flight was chartered through a private aviation company operating out of Teterboro Airport. Edward knows commercial flights require federal screening, but private charters process their own passenger manifests. He thinks he can hijack her flight, use her brand trip as a shield, and vanish into the UAE, where extradition laws are notoriously complicated. The agent looked at the paper, then back at me. "We need to ground that plane immediately." "I already did," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Vanguard has elite federal security clearances. The moment I bought his outstanding debt, I flagged his passport profile through the Department of Homeland Security. Edward is not going to Dubai. He is walking into a trap." 10 miles away at the private aviation terminal, Edward Harrison truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He burst through the glass doors of the luxury VIP lounge, sweating profusely. His suit ruined his breathing ragged. Courtney was sitting on a plush white leather sofa, surrounded by the remnants of her designer luggage. She was clutching the divorce papers Malcolm had handed her earlier that day, staring blankly at the runway. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Get up," Edward commanded, marching over and grabbing her roughly by the arm. "Tell the pilot we are leaving immediately. Tell him your father is joining the trip as a corporate sponsor." Courtney jerked her arm away, looking at him with red, puffy eyes. "I am not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice trembling. "Malcolm left me. The house is gone. The credit cards are declining. The brand sponsoring this trip just canceled my contract because the SEC froze our accounts. We have nothing left." Edward ignored her tears entirely. He turned his back on his weeping daughter and marched directly to the complimentary bar. He was completely detached from her suffering, focused entirely on his own preservation. He poured himself a generous glass of vintage champagne, his hands shaking so violently the crystal clinked sharply against the bottle. He took a long, deep swallow, closing his eyes as the expensive alcohol burned down his throat. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He looked out the panoramic window at the sleek private jet waiting on the tarmac. He had the cash hidden offshore. He just needed to step onto that plane, and he would be free. Vanguard, the FBI. Malcolm and my relentless vengeance would all be left behind in the ashes of his former life. He raised his glass in a silent mock toast to the city he had defrauded for decades. The violent explosion of shattering glass abruptly ended his premature celebration. The heavy double doors of the VIP lounge did not just open, they were violently kicked off their hinges. A swarm of heavily armed men in dark tactical gear poured into the room, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The letters FBI and TSA were emblazoned across their tactical vests in stark white lettering. Courtney let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping her divorce papers and diving behind the white leather sofa. Edward froze, the crystal champagne flute slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the polished marble floor, sending glass shards and alcohol flying across the room. He took one panicked step backward toward the runway exit, but it was entirely useless. "Get on the ground right now," a massive federal agent roared, leveling a tactical rifle directly at Edward's chest. "Hands where I can see them." Edward's arrogant facade finally completely disintegrated. His knees buckled under the sheer terror of the moment. He dropped heavily to the marble floor, his expensive suit soaking up the spilled champagne. Two agents immediately descended upon him, driving their knees forcefully into his back. They grabbed his arms, twisting them violently behind him and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Edward was hauled off the marble floor of the VIP lounge like a common street criminal. The federal agents did not care about his bespoke suit, his platinum watch, or his violent protests. They dragged the former billionaire through the private terminal, while flight attendants and wealthy onlookers recorded the entire humiliating spectacle on their smartphones. Courtney remained cowering behind the white leather sofa, clutching the divorce papers Malcolm had shoved at her chest hours earlier. When the authorities finally cleared the room, leaving her entirely alone, The absolute reality of her situation settled in like a suffocating weight. Her father was in federal custody facing decades behind bars. Her husband had abandoned her to save himself, offering state evidence against her family. Her bank accounts were frozen by the SEC, and her black titanium credit cards were now completely useless pieces of plastic. She had no home, no money, and no allies. The influencer brand trip to Dubai was cancelled, and the private jet sat empty on the tarmac. She was officially an outcast in the very city she used to rule. 72 hours later, the polished glass doors of Vanguard Capital swung open. I was standing on the mezzanine level of the grand lobby reviewing a quarterly restructuring report on my tablet. The building was humming with productive energy, the toxic culture of Edward's regime already being scrubbed clean. Then I heard the familiar shrill voice echoing off the acoustic ceiling panels. Courtney was arguing fiercely with the head receptionist. She looked completely out of place in the sleek corporate environment. She lacked her usual pristine, polished glamour. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, her designer trench coat looked slept in, and she was wearing oversized black sunglasses indoors to hide her swollen red-rimmed eyes. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Courtney shrieked, slamming her manicured hand on the reception desk. "I am Blair's sister. I demand you give me a visitor pass and tell her to come down here right now. This is a family emergency, and I will not be ignored by some entry-level desk clerk." I signaled for the security guards to hold their positions. I walked slowly down the sweeping glass staircase, letting my heels click rhythmically against the steps. I wanted her to see me descending from the executive heights she used to believe belonged to her. Courtney snapped her head toward the sound, ripping off her sunglasses. The moment she saw me standing tall and in absolute control, her aggressive posture completely vanished. She instantly shifted into her secondary defense mechanism. She burst into violent theatrical tears. "Blair, please!" Courtney cried, rushing toward the bottom of the staircase, but stopping short of actually stepping onto it. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left." The federal prosecutors sent a letter to my lawyer this morning. They are threatening me with accessory charges. They say I knowingly benefited from the wire fraud and the embezzled corporate funds. I stopped on the final step, looking down at her. "You did knowingly benefit, Courtney. You spent millions of dollars of stolen company funds on European vacations, imported Italian furniture, and luxury sports cars. You lived like a queen on Vanguard's bleeding balance sheet while Edward ran this company into the ground." "I did not know," she wailed, her hands shaking as she gripped the stainless steel railing. "Dad and Malcolm manipulated me. They lied to me every single day. I was just a victim of their toxic corporate games. You know how Dad is. He controls everything. He never let me see the financials. I am innocent, Blair. I swear I am. You are the only family I have left." I stared at her without a single ounce of sympathy. For 30 years she had happily played the golden child, happily watching Edward tear me down, happily participating in my exclusion from the family. She had mocked my career and belittled my ambitions. Now that her gold had turned to lead, she desperately wanted sisterly solidarity. "What exactly do you want, Courtney?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the vast lobby, causing several employees to pause and watch the exchange. She wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath and straightening her posture. She actually believed her performance was working. "I need an income. A real reliable income to pay for a high-powered defense attorney to fight these accessory charges. You own Vanguard now. You are the CEO. You can hire whoever you want. I need a job." I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. "A job? Doing what exactly? You have never worked a single day in your life. You have no degree, no corporate experience, and no marketable skills." Courtney puffed out her chest, deeply offended by the undeniable truth. "That is not true. I am a brand ambassador. I have over 400,000 followers on social media. I understand optics, digital engagement, and public perception. I can run your marketing department. You need a vice president of public relations to fix the company image after Dad's arrest. I can do that. I know how to spin a narrative." A starting salary of $200,000 would cover my legal retainers and get me a decent luxury apartment in the city. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was actually breathtaking. She was homeless, facing federal indictment, and begging her estranged sister for salvation, yet she still fully believed she was entitled to an executive corner office and a six-figure salary. She had learned absolutely nothing from her catastrophic downfall. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or list her endless flaws. I simply turned and walked toward the maintenance corridor hidden behind the reception desk. Courtney waited at the bottom of the stairs, a hopeful, smug smirk starting to form on her face. She truly thought I was going to retrieve an employment contract or a corporate checkbook. I emerged a moment later carrying a heavy yellow plastic bucket and a damp commercial floor mop. I walked directly over to Courtney and dropped the bucket right at her feet. The heavy plastic clattered loudly against the pristine lobby tiles, splashing a few drops of soapy water onto her designer boots. Courtney stared down at the cleaning supplies, her hopeful expression freezing into a mask of pure, utter confusion. "What is this?" "This is your new position," I stated, my voice deadly calm and carrying across the entire lobby for every watching employee to hear. "The janitorial staff is short-handed today. You will be scrubbing the floors of the ground-level bathrooms. Minimum wage. No corporate benefits. Take it or security throws you out for trespassing." Courtney looked at the wet mop and then back up at my face. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The fragile victim act evaporated instantly, replaced by the vicious, entitled monster she had always been. Her face turned an ugly, blotchy shade of crimson. "Are you out of your damn mind?" she screamed, kicking the yellow bucket so hard it tipped over, sending a wave of soapy water rushing across the floor. "I am not a maid. I am Courtney Harrison. I do not clean toilets. You petty, vindictive witch. You orchestrated this entire thing just to humiliate me." "You humiliated yourself," I replied, entirely unfazed by her pathetic outburst. I took one step back to avoid the spilled water and raised two fingers, signaling the guards waiting by the main entrance. "And your interview is officially over." The two burly security guards marched forward immediately, grabbing Courtney by both arms. She thrashed wildly, kicking her designer boots and screaming at the top of her lungs. She hurled every vile insult she could think of, her voice cracking with pure hysterical rage as they physically dragged her across the slick lobby floor. The automatic glass doors slid open and they tossed the former golden child out onto the cold concrete sidewalk, leaving her to face the brutal reality of her ruined life. Watching my sister hit the pavement was the final housekeeping task at Vanguard. With Courtney and Beverly permanently locked out of my corporate and personal life, I could finally focus entirely on the main event, the absolute legal destruction of my father. 6 months later, the federal trial of Edward Harrison commenced in the heart of the financial district. The media circus outside the courthouse was deafening. Reporters shoved microphones against the heavy glass doors, clamoring for a quote from the daughter who had ruthlessly dismantled her father's empire. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Edward sat at the defense table. He had traded his bespoke silk suits for a subdued gray two-piece, trying desperately to look like an honest, hard-working man, victimized by his own flesh and blood. His defense attorney launched into his opening statement with theatrical aggression. He paced in front of the jury box, pointing an accusing finger directly at the gallery where I sat. He painted a tragic portrait of Edward. He spun a ridiculous narrative about a loving, devoted father who built Vanguard Capital from nothing, only to be ousted by a deeply vindictive, disgruntled daughter. The defense argued that my actions were not driven by corporate justice, but by petty childhood jealousy. They claimed I was a scorned child playing corporate raider who manipulated Vanguard's stock prices, stole proprietary data, and orchestrated a hostile takeover purely to punish my family for perceived emotional slights. Edward looked at the jury with perfectly timed tears in his eyes, playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. He shook his head, staring down at his hands, as his lawyer described the mental anguish of a father betrayed. The assistant United States attorney remained completely unbothered by the dramatic display. When it was the prosecution's turn to dismantle the defense, they called Maxine Reynolds to the stand as an expert character witness. Maxine walked to the witness box with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. She wore a tailored crimson suit and swore the oath with absolute unwavering authority. Edward's defense attorney immediately went on the attack. He questioned her motives, suggesting she colluded with me to steal Edward's legacy for her own financial gain. He demanded to know why an industry titan like Maxine Reynolds would partner with an inexperienced runaway daughter driven by a petty family vendetta. Maxine leaned into the microphone. She did not raise her voice, but her words cut through the courtroom like razor blades. "I did not partner with a runaway daughter," Maxine stated, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "I partnered with a mathematical genius." Blair Harrison developed a proprietary algorithm that exposed a fundamental rot within Vanguard Capital. Edward Harrison was not running a successful investment firm. He was running a highly leveraged shell game propped up by fraudulent loans and embezzled client funds. The defense attorney sputtered, attempting to object, but Maxine talked right over him, her command of the room absolute. She systematically shredded every single financial lie Edward had built his career upon. She presented printed charts mapping out the toxic debt ratios Vanguard had hidden for years. She broke down the complex data models, explaining exactly how my algorithm bypassed Edward's cooked books and found the missing millions funneled into his offshore accounts. Maxine testified that without my intervention, Vanguard would have imploded within 6 months, taking thousands of innocent civilian investors down with it. She looked directly at the jury, her gaze piercing, and delivered the final fatal blow to Edward's defense. "Blair Harrison did not steal her father's legacy," Maxine declared. "She mercifully euthanized a dying, fraudulent company and built a legitimate empire on top of its grave. Edward Harrison is not a victim. He is a thief who lacked the intelligence to hide his tracks from his own brilliant daughter." Edward was visibly sweating now. His gray suit jacket showed dark patches under the arms. His lawyer scrambled back to the table, shuffling papers and furiously whispering to his client. The jury was no longer looking at Edward with sympathy. They were looking at him with deep, profound disgust. But the prosecution was not finished. The lead attorney stood up and called their star witness. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Malcolm walked down the center aisle. He looked drastically different from the manic, panicked executive I had confronted in the Vanguard lobby months ago. He wore a sharp black suit and his expression was completely devoid of emotion. He walked past Edward without making eye contact and took his seat in the witness box. Edward glared at his former son-in-law, his eyes burning with pure, lethal hatred. He still believed he had thoroughly intimidated Malcolm. He still believed Malcolm would stick to their original plan, taking the fall for the forged signatures and the Cayman accounts like a good, loyal scapegoat. The prosecutor began her questioning, laying out the timeline of the wire fraud. She asked Malcolm directly who had authorized the transfers, who had forged Beverly's signature on the loan documents, and who had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme. Malcolm leaned toward the microphone. He did not hesitate. "Edward Harrison authorized every single fraudulent transaction," Malcolm stated, his voice echoing clearly across the hushed gallery. "I was simply the instrument he used to execute the theft. He threatened to ruin me if I did not comply." "Objection!" the defense attorney roared, leaping to his feet, his face flushed with panic. "The witness is a proven liar trying to save his own skin by shifting blame to my client. Where is the tangible proof? Where is the evidence that Edward Harrison directed these actions?" Malcolm did not flinch. He slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. He pulled out a small silver external hard drive and placed it deliberately on the wooden ledge of the witness stand. "This is the Black Ledger," Malcolm announced, staring directly into Edward's terrified eyes. "It contains 10 years of encrypted internal emails, offshore bank routing numbers, and direct audio recordings of Edward Harrison explicitly ordering the embezzlement of Vanguard client funds. I backed up everything, every single day, to save myself from him." The defense attorney stared at the silver drive as if it were a live explosive. He opened his mouth to object again, but the words died in his throat. The federal prosecutor stepped forward with a sterile plastic evidence bag, collecting the hard drive with a brisk nod of satisfaction. Edward sagged against his heavy wooden chair, all the air leaving his lungs in one ragged exhale. His meticulously crafted defense was not just broken, it was entirely obliterated. The prosecution rested its case, leaving Edward's legal team with absolutely nothing but a hollow closing argument that the jury watched with thinly veiled contempt. When the jury was dismissed for deliberation, the courtroom emptied into the echoing marble corridors. The tension in the air was so thick it felt difficult to breathe. I walked out into the hallway with Maxine grabbing a black coffee from a nearby cart. We stood near the towering stone pillars, watching the remnants of the Harrison family wait for their ultimate fate. Beverly sat entirely alone on a long wooden bench. The vibrant, intimidating matriarch who used to command charity galas and country club luncheons had completely vanished. She looked aged by 20 years in a matter of weeks. Her tailored Chanel suit hung loosely on her frail, trembling frame, and her carefully applied makeup could not hide the deep, dark lines of absolute terror etched around her eyes. She had no one left. Courtney was long gone, cast out onto the streets. Edward refused to even look in her direction, pacing furiously at the opposite end of the hall with his panicked attorney. Beverly simply stared at the marble floor, clutching a shredded tissue, waiting for the legal system to dictate how much of her life she would lose for turning a blind eye to her husband's crimes. It took the jury less than 4 hours. When the heavy wooden doors swung open and the bailiff instructed everyone to return to their seats, a collective shiver ran through the gallery. A swift deliberation was never good news for the defense. I took my seat next to Maxine, smoothing the skirt of my suit. Edward stood at the defense table. His hands were gripping the edge of the wood so tightly his knuckles were bone white. He was sweating, his breathing shallow and rapid. Malcolm sat at the prosecution's table, looking remarkably relaxed. He had handed over the smoking gun, and he clearly believed that his cooperation had purchased his total freedom. He even offered Edward a faint, mocking smile across the aisle. The jury filed into the box, their faces stern and resolute. The judge, a gray-haired man with a reputation for merciless sentencing, took his seat at the bench and adjusted his reading glasses. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing through the silent room. "We have your honor," the foreperson replied, standing up and handing a folded piece of paper to the bailiff. The paper made its way to the judge, who reviewed it in silence for a long, agonizing moment. The judge looked down at Edward. "The defendant will rise." Edward forced himself to stand straight, trying to summon one last ounce of his former executive authority. He failed miserably. He looked like a cornered, terrified animal. "On count 1 of federal wire fraud, how do you find?" the judge asked. "Guilty," the foreperson read. The word dropped into the room like an anvil. Beverly let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth. "On count 2 of identity theft involving forged signatures on corporate loans, guilty." The foreperson continued down the list, methodically destroying Edward's life. "Count 3 wire fraud, guilty. Count 4 corporate embezzlement, guilty. 14 separate counts and 14 resounding declarations of guilt." By the time the foreperson finished reading, Edward was physically leaning against his lawyer to remain upright. His face was entirely devoid of color, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. The judge slammed his gavel against the sounding block, silencing the sudden surge of whispers from the gallery. "Edward Harrison," the judge stated, looking down at my father with absolute disgust. "Your actions demonstrate a breathtaking level of greed and a complete disregard for the law, your employees, and your own family. You built an empire on lies and manipulated everyone around you to fund an opulent lifestyle you did not earn. The court sees no reason to delay sentencing in this matter." Edward's lawyer tried to speak to ask for a separate sentencing hearing, but the judge raised a hand, cutting him off instantly. Malcolm leaned forward in his chair at the prosecution table, straightening his tie. He looked ready to stand up and walk out the front door, a free man. The judge turned his sharp gaze toward the prosecution table, locking eyes with Malcolm. The smug satisfaction wiped off Malcolm's face in an instant, replaced by sudden confusion. "Edward, you are sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison," the judge declared, his voice booming with absolute finality. "And Malcolm, despite your cooperation, Your notary fraud earns you 5 years. The judge struck the gavel with a sharp, deafening crack. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Edward collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, a hollow, guttural sob escaping his throat. Two federal marshals immediately flanked him, gripping his arms and hauling him to his feet. He did not look at me. He did not look at the jury. He was a broken, defeated shell of a man dragged through the side door to begin a 15-year nightmare in federal prison. Across the aisle, Malcolm sat completely paralyzed. He had gambled his freedom on turning state's evidence, fully believing his cooperation would grant him total immunity. As the marshals slapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists, the illusion shattered. 5 years in a federal penitentiary awaited him. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my suit, and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. The trial was officially over, but the real work of dismantling Edward's life was just beginning. 72 hours later, I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table in the Vanguard Capital Executive Boardroom. The room had already been stripped of Edward's pretentious oil paintings and antique humidors. I had summoned the remaining board members and the federal bankruptcy trustees to finalize the corporate execution. I did not speak. I simply slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood. The liquidation was absolute. I was officially carving up Edward's fraudulent empire, selling off the toxic debt to bottom-feeder collection agencies, and liquidating the bloated real estate portfolio he had used to hide his stolen funds. However, I was not destroying Vanguard entirely. I was harvesting its organs. Hidden beneath Edward's decades of financial rot were three highly valuable, perfectly viable tech subsidiaries. He had never understood their potential, treating them as mere tax write-offs and holding companies. I legally severed them from the dying parent company and integrated them directly into my own firm. Using my proprietary algorithm, I restructured their data architecture in a matter of days, launching a brand new, terrifyingly efficient tech division under my sole control. The transition was seamless, brutal, and flawlessly executed. Edward's legacy was officially erased from the financial district, replaced by a sleek modern machine that bore my signature alone. With the corporate restructuring complete, I had one final loose end to address: the personal restitution. The Harrison family estate sat on 2 acres of prime suburban real estate, a sprawling monument to Edward and Beverly's unyielding greed. When my black car pulled into the circular driveway, the property looked like a war zone. 5 massive moving trucks were parked on the manicured lawn. A swarm of auction house appraisers, federal liquidators, and burly movers swarmed the property, systematically dismantling 30 years of stolen luxury. I walked through the grand double doors into the cavernous foyer. The walls were already bare, the expensive artwork stripped away and replaced by pale, unfaded rectangles of paint. The screech of heavy packing tape echoed off the marble floors. Beverly stood in the center of the devastated living room. She looked small, frail, and entirely consumed by panic. She was clutching a single silver picture frame to her chest, watching in absolute horror as 2 men in jumpsuits wrapped her prized grand piano in heavy protective blankets. "You cannot take that!" Beverly shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "That is an antique. It belonged to my mother. You have no right to touch my things." The liquidator, a tired-looking woman holding a digital tablet, did not even blink. "Everything in this property was purchased with commingled illicit funds, ma'am. It is all subject to asset forfeiture. Place the frame on the table, please." I stepped into the room, my heels echoing sharply against the bare floorboards. Beverly spun around, her eyes widening as she saw me. The sheer venom in her expression was almost impressive, considering she had absolutely no power left to wield. "Are you here to gloat?" Beverly spat, her hands trembling so violently the silver frame rattled against her designer blouse. "Are you happy now, Blair? You destroyed your father. You destroyed this family. You are watching them strip my home down to the studs. Is this enough for you?" "I did not destroy anything, Beverly," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Edward destroyed this family the moment he decided to steal millions of dollars from innocent investors. I simply audited the wreckage." I am here representing Vanguard's new ownership to ensure that the corporate funds Edward illegally funneled into your personal renovations are properly recouped by the estate. Beverly gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. You are a monster. I am your mother. You lost the right to use that word a long time ago, I stated flatly. You stood by and cheered while Edward cut me out. You paraded Courtney around like a trophy while mocking my ambitions. You built your entire identity on the illusion of wealth, completely ignoring the fact that it was all a criminal lie. Now the illusion is over. A federal agent walked into the room holding a slim manila folder. He bypassed Beverly entirely and handed me a clipboard to sign confirming the transfer of the property deed to the holding trust. I signed my name with a fluid, steady motion and handed it back. The agent then turned to Beverly, extending the manila folder. Mrs. Harrison, this is your final financial disclosure from the Department of Justice. Your personal accounts, your offshore trusts, and your joint holdings have been fully seized to cover the court-ordered restitution to the victims of Vanguard Capital. Beverly dropped the silver frame. It clattered against the floor, the glass cracking instantly. She snatched the folder from the agent's hand, tearing it open with frantic, desperate fingers. She scanned the top page, her breath hitching in her throat. She flipped to the second page, then the third, her eyes darting wildly across the columns of numbers. She was frantically searching for a hidden account, a secret safety net, a sliver of the massive fortune she believed she was entitled to keep. She found nothing. Beverly stared at the bottom line of the final page. The number was printed in stark, unforgiving black ink. Net worth $0. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto a cheap plastic folding chair that one of the movers had left behind, the only piece of furniture remaining in her spectacular empty living room. She stared at the paper, her mind unable to comprehend the absolute totality of her financial ruin. Where am I supposed to go? Beverly whispered, her voice a hollow, broken rasp. The house is gone. The money is gone. Courtney will not answer my calls. I have nowhere to sleep tonight. Blair, please. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing at all. That sounds like a logistical problem, Beverly, I said, turning my back on her and walking toward the front door. You should probably start looking for a shelter. I hear the waiting lists get very long after dark. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was bathed in the warm glow of thousands of crystal chandeliers. 6 months ago, my father had hosted the Vanguard Capital annual gala in this exact room, surrounded by sycophants and financial parasites who worshipped his fraudulent empire. Tonight, the room belonged to me. The Vanguard Ascendancy Gala was the most exclusive ticket in the financial district. The guest list was entirely purged of Edward's old cronies. In their place sat the sharpest minds in financial technology, algorithmic trading, and international banking. They were not here to kiss the ring of a legacy patriarch. They were here to witness the birth of a new era. I stood near the velvet-draped entrance holding a flute of sparkling water, watching the room hum with electric anticipation. Wall Street titans who had once dismissed me as Edward Harrison's invisible daughter now tripped over themselves trying to make eye contact. Maxine Reynolds glided to the center of the grand stage, tapping the microphone. The ambient chatter of 500 elite guests instantly fell dead silent. Maxine wore a striking emerald gown, projecting the absolute authority she had wielded throughout our entire hostile takeover. "Welcome to the future of Vanguard," she announced, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "For decades, this industry has relied on smoke and mirrors. We relied on the illusion of stability while ignoring the rotting foundations beneath our feet. Today, we strip away the illusion. Today, Vanguard is no longer an archaic investment firm relying on outdated leverage. We are a premier financial technology powerhouse driven by undeniable, flawless data." The crowd erupted into sustained applause. Maxine raised a hand, commanding them to quiet down. None of this would be possible without the architect of our new infrastructure. She continued, her gaze finding mine across the vast room. "It is my profound honor to introduce the woman who designed the predictive modeling algorithm that saved this company from total ruin. Please welcome the new majority shareholder and official Chief Data Officer, of Vanguard Capital, Blair Harrison. The applause was deafening. I handed my glass to a passing waiter and walked down the center aisle. I did not wear a flashy designer gown or diamonds bought with stolen money. I wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo suit, a sharp silver lapel pin, and my hair pulled back into a severe, sleek twist. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had fought a brutal war and emerged completely victorious. I stepped onto the stage and took my place at the podium. The bright stage lights illuminated the sea of expectant faces looking up at me. I adjusted the microphone, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. I did not come here tonight to talk about the past. I began, my voice projecting with cool, steady confidence. The past is dead. It was built on a foundation of stolen equity and fragile egos. Instead, I want to talk about reality. I want to talk about the undeniable power of truth. The room was utterly silent, hanging onto every single word. For years, I was told that success required conformity. I was told that the only way to survive in this industry was to blindly follow the established legacy, to smile, nod, and ignore the discrepancies on the balance sheets. But mathematics does not lie. Algorithms do not care about your family name. Data does not respect your country club memberships or your offshore accounts. Data only respects intellectual integrity. I looked across the front row, making eye contact with the heavy hitters of the financial world. When you build your life on self-reliance, no one can ever dismantle it. I continued, leaning slightly into the microphone. When you rely on your own intellect, your own sweat, and your own relentless pursuit of the truth, you become completely untouchable. Vanguard is no longer a monument to one man's vanity. It is an engine of pure, unadulterated transparency. We will not operate in the shadows. We will let the numbers lead, and we will leave the dinosaurs behind in the dust. I did not mention Edward. I did not mention Malcolm Courtney or Beverly. They were not worth my breath. Refusing to even acknowledge their existence was the ultimate victory. I was entirely beyond them. Thank you for joining us in the light, I concluded, stepping back from the podium. The ballroom exploded. 500 industry leaders stood up simultaneously, delivering a thunderous standing ovation. Maxine caught my eye from the side of the stage and offered a rare, genuine smile of deep respect. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in corporate dominance. I navigated the ballroom, shaking hands with tech billionaires and international regulators. I secured 3 massive institutional contracts before the dessert plates were even cleared. I was in my element, surrounded by people who spoke my language and valued my mind over my pedigree. Shortly after midnight, I signaled to my security detail that I was ready to leave. I slipped out through the private VIP exit while Maxine handled the remaining guests. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk bordering the hotel. My private chauffeur stood by the open door of my sleek black town car, waiting patiently under the glow of a street lamp. "Good evening, Miss Harrison," the driver said, offering a polite nod. "Good evening, Marcus," I replied, pulling my trench coat tighter around my shoulders. I took one step toward the warmth of the car when a sudden frantic shuffling sound caught my attention. It came from the dark, narrow alleyway adjacent to the hotel service entrance. I paused, signaling Marcus to hold his position. A figure stepped out of the freezing shadows and into the harsh yellow light of the street lamp. I stopped, completely frozen in place. It was Beverly. The woman standing before me was entirely unrecognizable as the socialite who used to terrorize high-end boutiques. Her expensive blonde hair was matted and greasy, clinging to her pale, sunken cheeks. She wore a stained, oversized wool coat that was missing 3 buttons, and her bare feet were shoved into cheap plastic sandals. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering in the cold night air. In her raw, blistered hands, she clutched 2 heavy black plastic trash bags containing the absolute entirety of her worldly possessions. Beverly stood shivering in the biting autumn wind. The 2 black trash bags she gripped contained whatever pitiful scraps she had managed to scavenge before the federal liquidators threw her out of the estate. She took a step toward me, her cheap plastic sandals scraping harshly against the concrete sidewalk. "Blair," she gasped, her voice a ragged, breathless wheeze. Marcus moved instinctively, placing himself between me and the disheveled woman, but I raised a single hand. I signaled for him to stand down. I was not in danger. The woman trembling under the street lamp was a ghost, a pathetic echo of a matriarch who no longer existed. Beverly did not hesitate. The pride that had fueled her entire existence completely evaporated. She dropped heavily to her knees, hitting the cold, hard pavement with a dull thud. She let go of her trash bags and lunged forward, grabbing the hem of my tailored trench coat with her raw, blistered hands. "Blair, please," Beverly cried, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I am your mother. You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing." I looked down at her hands staining the pristine fabric of my coat. I did not pull away. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. The rage that had once consumed me during my childhood was entirely gone, leaving behind a vast Arctic emptiness. "I have no money," she continued, sobbing hysterically, her tears cutting tracks through the grime on her pale cheeks. "I have no home. My friends will not answer my calls. The shelters are full and it is so cold out here. You have to take me into your penthouse. You have the room. You have the money. You have to forgive me. I am your mother, Blair. I gave you life." Her pleading echoed down the quiet city street, a pathetic symphony of desperation. She was begging for the very things she had denied me my entire life: warmth, shelter, security, and basic human compassion. I stared down at her sobbing form. The emotional detachment I felt was absolute. I was looking at a complete stranger. I slowly reached into my limited edition $5,000 designer handbag. The soft click of the metallic clasp seemed incredibly loud in the quiet night air. Beverly stopped crying instantly. She held her breath, her desperate eyes tracking my every movement. Her innate greed flared to life, cutting through her misery. She watched my hand emerge from the bag holding a small, pristine black velvet box. Beverly let go of my coat, wiping her dirty hands on her stained trousers. Her eyes lit up with sudden, ravenous hope. She stared at the velvet box, as if it were a holy relic. She clearly believed it contained her salvation. A heavy brass key to a luxury penthouse suite. A thick stack of high-limit credit cards. A corporate check with enough zeros to restore her former glory. She believed that despite everything, blood would win out, and I would rescue her. I held the velvet box out. Beverly snatched it from my hand, her fingers trembling with desperate anticipation. She snapped the hinged lid open. The street lamp illuminated the contents perfectly. There was no key. There was no platinum card. Nestled on the dark satin lining was a handful of dull, heavily rusted safety pins and a single severely crumpled $20 bill. Son. Beverly stared at the rusted metal, her jaw dropping open. The hopeful light in her eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by profound, agonizing confusion. She looked from the box up to my face, her hands shaking violently. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I looked down at her, my expression completely blank, and my voice ice cold. "Use these to hold your life together," I stated plainly. Beverly flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She stared at the rusty pins, the ultimate symbol of the second-hand scraps and discarded remnants she had forced me to survive on, while she draped herself in stolen diamonds. "You do not deserve new things." I continued, turning my body away from her entirely. I walked past her kneeling form and approached the open door of my Maybach. Marcus stood sharply at attention, waiting for my final command. "But how am I supposed to get out of here?" Beverly wailed, holding the crumpled $20 bill in the air. "Take an Uber," I said, stepping into the plush leather interior of the luxury vehicle. "My driver is busy." Marcus firmly shut the heavy armored door, severing my connection to the outside world. I settled into the heated leather seat, crossing my legs and staring straight ahead. The thick-tinted window rolled up with a smooth mechanical hum, cutting off the sound of Beverly's desperate shrieking. "Drive," I instructed. The powerful engine of the Maybach purred to life. The heavy luxury car glided smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the late-night city traffic. I did not look back. I did not check the rearview mirror. I left Beverly exactly where she belonged, sobbing alone on the freezing concrete sidewalk, Entirely consumed by the shadows of the streetlights, my life was finally my own and the past was completely erased. The story of Blair and Beverly powerfully illustrates that true security cannot be built on a foundation of deceit, greed, or toxic family dynamics. Beverly's ultimate downfall reveals that material wealth, when stolen or unearned, is temporary and fragile. In contrast, Blair's triumph proves that authentic power stems from independence, intellectual integrity, and the courage to sever ties with abusers. Sometimes the most profound justice is not found in explosive revenge, but in the quiet, absolute detachment of walking away and leaving people to face the natural consequences of their actions. Share your experiences with toxic relatives and comment below.